Jeremy Corbyn has declared that he lives rent-free in the head of our latest Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Funny thing to say. Let's have a listen.
He gave a wholly inaccurate representation of the 2019 election manifesto, which he must have been fully well aware of because he took part in many debates concerning the content of that manifesto during the election campaign. Could you guide me, Mr. Speaker, on how the Prime Minister could correct the record, and if I'm going to live rent-free in his head, at least he could accurately reflect what I think and what I say, rather than inventions made up by him or his office?
Ooh, a ghost is haunting British politics. It is the ghost of Jeremy Corbyn. What is it about this bearded allotment dweller that so obsesses politicians and media outlets alike long after he stopped being leader of the Labour Party? Now, I mean, I say this because any time, for example, I criticise the current leader of the Labour Party, my mentions get bombarded with an army of his dedicated and, I'm not going to lie, quite tedious fans. And they're like, ooh, you want Corbyn back? Why are you so obsessed with Corbyn? Why do you love Corbyn so much? Why don't you marry Jeremy Corbyn? Which is like, well, I didn't mention him. You just mentioned him. In fact, you mention him all the time in my mentions. I think maybe just respond to criticisms of, say, Keir Starmer on their own terms, if you can, rather than just going on about Jeremy Corbyn all the time. But it is, it's Jeremy Corbyn. It's Corbyn derangement syndrome. I suppose that's what we're talking about. Now, I think what's instructive is the current Tory strategy is to try and tie Keir Starmer to supposedly doomed, monstrously unpopular left-wing policies. That's why the ghost of Jeremy Corbyn keeps being invoked by Rishi Sunak, which we are led to believe were permanently buried by the 2019 Tory victory. Now, I think it's important to separate the policies, left-wing policies, if you like, or radical or transformative policies, whatever you want to call them, to separate them from the politico-media obsession with the figure of many times winner of the parliamentary beard of the year, actually, Jeremy Corbyn, an accolade which I think doesn't get the appreciation it deserves. Not something, well, I'm not an MP, but I'm in no danger of winning it. Whatever you think about Labour's disastrous 2019 defeat, though, no one knocking on doors, listening to voters who were like, nah, I'm not voting Labour. No one heard them say, do you know what? I would vote Labour, but I just don't support hiking taxes on rich people. I just think they have it ever so hard. Leave them alone. Those poor, oppressed rich people, don't tax them. Or, for example, I'm just too emotionally attached to my privatised railway system. I just love being ripped off with just completely chaotic train times that they never turn up, and I have to stand overcrowded with someone's armpit in my face for several hours. Or, for example, I just love being ripped off by energy companies and just do not actually go anywhere near their shareholders who deserve their dividends. Or I could go on. I think, young people actually deserve to be saddled with monstrously large amounts of debt because they dare to dream to a university education. These were not things people heard on the doorstep. Whatever you think about the reasons for the defeat of Labour, it wasn't because of them. And that's obviously what Rishi Sunak is trying to do, to tie unpopular policies with what left-wing policy, supposedly what happened. Now, we might disagree, those of us, you watching or listening to this, with how much the defeat was caused by what I would describe as a nightmare culture war unleashed by Brexit, which tore apart Labour's electoral coalition, leaving Labour at the time in what I would describe as, frankly, an impossible position, because overwhelmingly its membership voted for Remain. Most of its voters also voted for Remain, but its Leave voting voters were concentrated in marginal seats, which Labour needed to keep or to win in order to have any chance of forming a government, and they were torn between the two. And increasingly, as the Remain majority asserted itself, as the voter as the electorate polarised over Brexit throughout, particularly 2018 and 2019, Labour was dragged obviously further into a position of supporting a new referendum. It also, what it did is strip Jeremy Corbyn of the asset, which I think really came to the fore in the 2017 election, which is, you might not agree with him, but he says what he means and he means what he says. And because Brexit dominated everything rather than the left-wing policies, actually, which were popular in the 2017 general election, which was not supposed to talk about the 2017 general election. I know Labour didn't win, but Labour had its biggest surge in votes since 1945, won 40% of the vote compared to the Tories' 42%, and is the only time since 1997 that Labour has increased its seats But we're not supposed to talk about that or draw any lessons from that about whether that was a step in the right direction. But those policies and ideas in the 2 years after that, 2.5 years after that, suddenly were completely airbrushed out of existence because everyone was just talking about Brexit all the time. And because Labour was increasingly dragged into a different position from accepting the referendum result to supporting a new referendum, whatever you think about whether that was a good or bad thing, because it was dragged by political gravity in that way, it made Jeremy Corbyn look less like a man of principle and conviction, which is, as I said, was one of his main assets, I suppose, it was, let's be honest. We might disagree too about the way the media onslaught, which portrayed him as some terrorist-loving hater of Britain and all the rest of it, played its role. But, we can also discuss mistakes made by the Labour leadership. I wrote an entire book in which I tried to do that. What I'm trying to do is detach all of that from the policies, because those policies were not the cause of the terrible rout. They were the cause, I would say, of Labour's surge in votes in 2017. Those policies which were very popular in 2017 didn't suddenly become unpopular, and the polling shows that whether it be taxing the rich or nationalisation of key utilities, even Tory voters support many of those ideas. In fact, a majority of Tory voters. And actually, those policies have become more relevant than ever because look at the energy crisis. I mean, the privatised model is more starkly obvious in terms of its failures than ever before. Look at the railways, the state of the railways. Even the government, since the 2019 election, has had to increase state control in the railways because the privatised model is so screwed over. Look at student debt in terms of how young people have got screwed over because, they formed, rightly, a cordon sanitaire around older people during the COVID crisis. Many of them paying through the nose tuition fees, while often during COVID, just having basically lessons on Zoom. But how young people have still got screwed over and over again, and how student debt eats into their living standards as well as anything else, I think is really more relevant than ever. In terms of workers' rights, we've seen obviously trade unions organising across the board because of the fall in living standards. So the role of trade unions in terms of securing workers a better standard of living, given they create the wealth, which then ends up in the pockets of a tiny few, in terms of trade union and workers' rights, those are more relevant than they were, for example, in 2019. And finally, taxing the rich now, given the catastrophe of Liz Truss's attempt to cut taxes on the rich, now even the Tories are increasing corporation tax. But also this, supposed black hole in the finances, which I think is very much dependent on how you define the fiscal rules and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, rather than cutting public services, now there is clearly a stronger argument for increasing taxes on income and wealth for those who are doing very well than there was in 2019. Those policies are more relevant than ever. So I think, obviously, the Tories should be confronted head on with an unapologetic defence of policies that are just as radical as the crises affecting Britain are severe. Now, obviously, Rishi Sunak's attacks on Keir Starmer are nonsense because, sadly for you and I, for those of you who agree with me, many of you, I'm sure, watching or listening to this won't, but nonetheless, for those of you who do, Keir Starmer is not a closet left-winger. He's not a closet Corbynite. He's not going to suddenly become Prime Minister and rip off the mask and there will be Jeremy Corbyn with his clipped beard. Not going to happen. What Keir Starmer did do is stand in the leadership election of 2020 pretending to be a continuity Corbyn candidate with a series of radical domestic policies borrowed from the Corbyn era, in which he described the 2017 manifesto as Labour's foundational document, and then he repudiated it, which was an act of terrible deceit. You might think to yourself, well, politics is terrible and dirty, you've got to lie in order to win. I don't agree with you. I think that's awful kind of degrading of democracy, but whatever, you do you if you want to be a cynical hack, that's your life, not mine. I obviously will disagree with you in terms of standing by honesty, integrity in politics, I'm afraid. But in any case, that's what he did, and that leaves him open to attacks because clearly he was, they can say, well, you clearly stood on a Corbynite manifesto, so obviously you're a closet Corbynite. I mean, it's not some sort of like QAnon conspiracy, is it? It's not some weird, wild conspiracy theory to try and pin that on Keir Starmer. Obviously, the real argument is, was Keir Starmer, because he served under Jeremy Corbyn in his shadow cabinet, backed him to become Prime Minister, was that something he didn't really believe, and he was just biding his time to become, because he thought it better positioned to be leader of the Labour Party? None of the answers there are good for him, are they? But in any case, in terms of the whole political elite, Rishi Sunak's attacks are nonsense, given these policies are popular and transformative. As for Keir Starmer, well, he's opened himself up to these attacks because, well, of his cynical, deceitful record, I'm afraid. Not a fan of the political elite as a whole. I know that angers some of you, but my job is to tell the truth, and our political elite suck. But the argument for these radical ideas are more needed than ever. So Corbyn can live rent-free in Rishi Sunak's head, but I think it's for all of us to make the argument for policies which are more salient than they were before. Thanks for watching, as ever. Please like, subscribe. I'll see you next time.